Okay, thanks very much for the general introduction. Can you please just confirm that you can see and hear me well?
Yes, all good.
Okay, great. Thanks. Great pleasure to be actually following such a great speaker. Emma, I just checked your profile and kind of really impressed with what you presented. But with that, I think you also laid out really nice foundation for some discussion that I would like to have, besides talking about the machine learning methods and present some work done jointly in our Center for Energy Markets together with Shiva Madhathani, who also has a talk later in the sessions talking more about technical details that will not be covered in my talk. And I will be talking about the different approaches from technical perspective that we have to empower the transition. And even though the discussion that I'm going to present will be focused on the power sector, however, my discussion will be quite general, and later on, by the end of the talk, I will talk a little bit more about how other industrial sectors and non-industrial sectors may use those approaches. With that, let me proceed and first give a quick overview on what I will be talking about today. So first of all, I have to apologize for those of you who might be from machine learning community, so that a part of the talk that we'll be talking about technical details might seem a little bit too general, but I did it on purpose. I believe that now in our hands, we have great tools. Not all of us are using it to the full degree. I personally still kind of learned that from the professionals. However, we have to look into that as I will talk the reality with increased amount of data, but also with the complexity, as Emma and other speakers have been mentioning today, with the need to look into the global perspective, into the interlinkages across sectors, across the economies, across different goals that we may have in mind. So we really have to look into those methods. And so the simple introduction, and I believe some encouragement to do so, is worthwhile doing. With that, I will then move to the discussion on why we have to still be careful by how do we pick our tools and how do we use that. I will identify some gaps and opportunities, and with that formulate the question specifically for the power sector. However, with that, as I said, I will also envisage how the research can further be extended and applied in other sectors. Stating some questions, I will show how one can address them, and with that provide some new insights, incredibly useful as we talk about the governments trying to move towards the carbon neutrality, but also overall structural shift into how we approach the business today. So with that, I mean, look into their sustainability, which embraces far beyond factors that just the carbon. And with that, I will finish by talking a little bit about what I believe is a research agenda that all of us have to keep in mind as we do our research. Okay, so first of all, let me start with something that many of us now considered as given, but I think it's worthwhile to remind ourselves why we are in that conversation. So when we talk about the climate change, when we talk about the carbon neutrality, when we talk about the transition to sustainability, what pushes us is different factors that affect pretty much every country around the world. So those include climate change. Sure, we see more and more different weather-related issues and hazards, other bad implications, and I'm not just talking about, you know, the fires and floods. Even the extreme heat and extreme cold are already shown to bring quite a lot of victims, the human victims, apart from the economic burden on us. The air quality, all that also imposes health issues. But now we're also facing the challenge of the differences in geopolitical situation and the inability in some cases to do what we should and have to do from the social perspective, not just economic perspective. And in part, this is due to the disbalances that we have in terms of the energy. And so this is kind of all pushes us to focus more on the energy sector that, first of all, is the main greenhouse gas emitter, but also the main driver for a lot of geoeconomic and geopolitical discussions, as previous speaker has been talking about. With that, in order to really do that, as we also have heard and kind of keep reading from every newspaper today, we have to face the number of challenges. Those challenges, first of all, stem from the fact that we hear a lot of different facts, opinions, conflicts from different sides, whether those different companies, sectors, different regions, global economies clashes in their interests. And so how to deal with all that has been a big challenge. One way to look into that is to try and employ really powerful methods that help us to do both the data-driven analysis and the predictions and projections that would allow us to gain an understanding on where we can move that whole system. And so with that, let's start talking about those powerful, new, in some cases quite old tools. Okay, so now we hear increasingly about the supercomputers that many universities, organizations have been installing. We also see how a separate set of businesses have arrived just focused on the data collection, data cleaning, data presentation. So the data mining and the descriptive and predictive analytics become a new type of industry of its own. Why it is important? Because we use it in order to extract some knowledge, to gain some understanding, and with that build the algorithms that allow us explain things as well as predict. So what drives our interest, what inspires all those models that we currently see? Some of them are actually just the expansion and enhancement of the models that have been around for a while. So first of all, we have to now handle the large areas of data. And when I speak about the large areas of data, I'm speaking both about the increasing number of attributes that we keep collecting. We now describe pretty much every aspect of our life, of the nature around us, and that concerns, once again, the global perspective. But we also keep increasing the data set that we have as the history unveils. With that, looking into all those huge data, we have to find a way to find the patterns, identify those patterns for the usefulness of further analysis, find relationships and interrelationships within those data, and then apply it for different business, economic, social, environmental aspects. So with that, as already been also noticed by the previous speakers, I would confirm that also in my experience, I have seen that the business and industry have been embracing that those very powerful tools to much larger degree than government or any other stakeholders, seeing really the ability to improve the economic value, the technical efficiency, while the policymakers and different public parties have been either quite cautious about ability to use it, consider it as a type of the black box. So this is a little bit the old logic looking to big models that I can handle or cannot really understand into, or just not sure about these new capabilities. So in some cases, the public would trust those new models. So the AI, artificial intelligence, become a buzzword. And so now I believe the common public increasingly trusting to those capabilities, but just doesn't know how much this AI and machine learning methods can do for us. And so to speak more about that, I believe we all have to be educators, and not just within the university walls, but far beyond going to any public point. But when we do so, we still have to be very careful in order to keep the trust in what we present and what we do with regard to research. And so let's overview what type of tools do we use and what are the pros and cons where we have to be careful and about what before we move to the use of those tools. So what I did preparing for the talk is I got the Web of Science and I screened through the energy, environmental, some other literature, what are the key AI, but more specifically machine learning algorithm has been used. And I've been looking just into supervised machine learning algorithms to analyze the data. Okay, so I list here just kind of the top ones that pop out, and those include the all type regressions, which have been boosted quite a a bit with different models. So now there are switch point regression and so support vector machines. So those, I believe, a little bit of the dying art. And then the ones about which I would like to talk a little bit more, as I'm myself increasingly involved in using those, include decision trees, which is again the old technique used in business, but been bumped further to be also used as a classification trees in random forest, gradient boosting, extreme gradient boosting, so other type machine, Bayesian tree models, and neural networks. So as you see, the list is long from one perspective, short from the other, but that represents those key golden methods currently used, and so it's worthwhile to look more into them. So, but before we look on the technical side, so let's see how those methods are traditionally used. And again, scraping through the set of the research papers, what I find is that primarily we use those models to understand, can we and how accurately can we predict different things. So we like to use those models as a tool to do some predictions. Some smaller cohort of works look into the ability to identify the drivers for what we observe. Would it be the prices? Would it be inflation, the gross in production, some other things? Yet almost non-existent part of literature, and that would be later the key focus of my discussion today, is the models used to do some normative analysis, namely the analysis that would help what would happen if I do this and that. And here I have to do some remark that would not relate to the literature on production, where some of these AI and machine learning methods do indeed used for how can I change, for instance, the recipe for particular production process to improve it. Okay, so now let's start. So I would like to start with the old quote that I believe many of you have heard, but worthwhile reminding ourselves that all models are wrong, but some are useful. And so with that, we have to keep thinking about the benefits of the techniques that we use, but be careful with regard to the possible drawbacks of those methods. And so developing different models, here I'm bringing you the daily average power prices in Germany with the last 5 years history. And so this is something that all of us who look into the data quite frequently look into in the past, analyzing it with either time series analysis with some other things. With the advancement in statistical and machine learning, we start look into those historical data as they said, what happens in every next year with regard to the distribution of prices. As an economist, I also prefer to look into this type of distribution because that's a distribution that helps me understand how any change I may have in my power system may affect the customers, would this be commercial, households, or industrial, and with that, what kind of economic impact may it have on my country or the global level. And so looking into that, the one thing that I realized is that those distributions, as you see here, have been changing over time in a quite substantial manner if you look into the 15 and later into 2020, for a number of reasons. Can I name those reasons? If you ask me again as an economist, I can probably name you 2 or 3 major reasons, but it remains the question on how accurate will I be and whether I can give advice with regard to how those drivers for the next year price distribution would be. And how can I, thinking about those price distribution, first of all, do predictions, but also projections with those. But before we go to projections, so let's see in more detail back into the models. So what do we do first? So we collect the data that would help us to understand the behavior. And so these days, as I said, we have the numerous capabilities. We can collect in our particular center, we hold over 100 different variables that potentially may help us understand the power prices. And here I speak specifically about the Germany, but the analysis around the world would have a very similar nature. And so look into those distributions would then turn into the variety of factors where for each of it, we can look into the scatter plot. And so this is the matrix that helps to understand the performance analytics. So the way it works is you look into the variables. So the first one is a power price, and then you can look into the correlation coefficient between that one and any other variable. You can look into the significance of that, marked with the red stars, and you can look into the scatter plot. I'm not going to be sitting on detail here, but I would like to bring your attention that to look into all those correlation coefficients. So first of all, look into all the variables I see, how none of them can individually predict the power prices, okay? The other thing is also now when I look into the change in the power prices, and you can also think about the steel prices, some other sector prices, and look into the change over time, I may see quite a dramatic change, which I may not, again, be able to predict with the history I have at hand. So as a data analyst, what we do, we try to disentangle, first of all, the complexity. So looking, for instance, into the correlation between the power prices and the expected load, we'll look into the scatter plot. We can say, yeah, there is kind of something that I definitely see captured by the correlation coefficient. However, if I look into more detail into this mixed distribution, what I see is that it actually represents a mixture of different behaviors, which the structural models available there with the expert's opinion and the expert knowledge can already help me to understand. So one of the modes can be explained by the hours with large share of renewables, whereas the other mode with regard to the prices can be represented by hours with a lower share of renewables or almost non-existent output of renewables, but the use of natural gas peakers. And so in order to get, once again, to understand and predict the future values, we have to disentangle the complexity of the present and try to bring it to the future. So now let's talk a little bit technical details, which will last for a few slides. So first, starting with regression. So these all textbook models, what's good and bad about them? Let me start with the good. So the good is you can have your data, then you can build the extrapolation, and you can see where the numbers may go. With that, however, we have to stick to the functional form. And as we hear about different regulations being introduced, different shifts with regard to the behavioral patterns, with regard to the forced changes in the supply chains, can we really explain that relationships will be held, or should we expect that there might be switch in those relationships? And if the latter is the case, then the regression become an ill instrument that is not able to handle the flexibility that we need. And so with that, we may move to another set of methods, which are based on the classification trees. So what is the nature of those? The nature of those that you once again start with the variable you want to explain, and then your data. And then every time you try to use different variable to split your data into different buckets, where you will then look into the subset of observations, each of which now you can try to approximate either describing by the distribution of values, which traditionally we look into the average. If we look into the major existing models, the modifications exist, they try to look into medians. Where the danger lays is that those distributions might still be not so good looking. Second is the distribution that we might be splitting into two smaller buckets where the insight that we get will be too limited and we have the danger of overfitting. We can also split the data into buckets and within every bucket use some function. So what prevents us from using the regression? And there are those assemble and mix methods as well. But the danger is not even in just those two things. There are other risks, and those risks concern on how we really do the splits. So here is, for instance, one of the subset with which we end up looking into our data for the power markets, where the split was done, and now I'm looking just into the power markets and the carbon price. So those data, just from the first, from afar, one can definitely split into several buckets or clusters. So the green and orange lines indicate how you would split those. And so this is also pretty obvious with the naked eye. However, the one thing that you may notice is that here you have a gap in data. And so when it comes to the choose of model and the model accuracy, it actually might be important whether the split was happening here or here on the lower or upper part where your data stop. And so it may not be matter for your data that you already have, but if you're going to do the predictions or projections, that could be something that may bring some error in what you will see. And so the one way to really overcome that is those methods traditionally used on multiple trees. And those trees could be designed in a different way. So with the gradient boosting, we have the gradient for the error. So we try to improve our error in performance. The extreme gradient boostings tries to also handle some overfitting issues. But the fundamental flaw of those models is inability to extrapolate. They take the data that you show them, they look into the distributions, whatever the data were split, but then they would try to fit the samples or do some simulations, but within those samples that they saw, not beyond the range that's been presented. However, with those faults, however, we also see a number of really strong things behind those methods. And those include the ability to do the classification trees, detect the patterns, ability to use the categorical variables and correlated variables that we traditionally have issues with their classical regression models. And then if the ranges are kind of okay with regard to the future values, the extrapolation may not be such a big issue. Moving next, and kind of finishing on that, I would like to mention the Bayesian and neural network models. Those present somewhat similar challenges. The first one, first of all, requires a big expert participation to set up the prior beliefs, which may once again change over time as we see the economies transitioning, as we see the industrial sector and the as well as the public changing its behavioral patterns. The other thing that's common for both neural networks as well as the Bayesian methods is the fact that we need quite a lot of data for training and usually a lot of computational capacity that make those methods very limited in terms of usefulness for researchers. And so with that, the random forest gradient boosting and extreme gradient boosting is a set of models that many of us have been focusing on. So how do we use them? What exactly we do? So the studies, now speaking specifically about the electricity price predictions, have been competing by looking into different number of observations showing and using longer histories or the greater database with regard to the number of variables, but most of the time being quite silent with regard to the overfitting. There has also been very limited discussion with regard to what actually are the key drivers. So look into the 100 variables versus 200 variables. So how can I compare the two? So for that analysis, you may perform some comparison, but it will take too many efforts if you look into their exponentially increasing number of papers. Yet if every paper would identify what the key drivers are, we may have a much better handle for the comparison. And so in our analysis, we look into the model with all the variables, which are close to 100, versus picking just the top variables to show how solving the issues of the overfitting may give us even a better result in times. With that, the studies out there traditionally been focusing on the accuracy of predictions, but doing so in extremely short, usually hours or even days, updates, and fewer studies focusing on 2 to 3 months predictions. And while this is a great target if you're in the trading business, if you're just in the business related to the power sales, that has limited value to the economists, to the policymakers, to the public sector that tries to understand how to move to the carbon neutrality, how to handle the sustainability, what are the costs of those. And so with that, last but least, are also the tests of the robustness of those predictions, even if we turn those models for all those goals that I just mentioned. And so with that, looking into errors, it's important to note that even if we would have the errors reported, as for instance, I show here the difference between the actual values and the values predicted by the random forest model, I can take those and look into the fact that my model contained the data for 3 different years, and look into those errors now per year. I could see whether my years were predicted better than the others, and then try to dig into what made the prediction a better particular year, so that I may not be able to improve the model dramatically, but I would have more quantitative analysis of the uncertainty that that model can carry with that. Okay. And so now let me stop for a second to models that are not artificial intelligence or machine learning driven models. So how the economists look into the problem. So first of all, they traditionally focus on the structural models, and they quite often try to analyze the factors that will affect the price from the conceptual standpoint. With that, they would also employ different statistical methods like Monte Carlo simulations, other testing of the hypothesis, and they would use those methods further to run different scenarios to first of all, once again, confirm their hypothesis about the key variables. So something that we could do also with our powerful tools, but rarely approach trying to present yet bigger database without saying so how useful that big database was. And then also studying the reverse causality effects, strategic behavior, and the different fragmentation of the market. And so with all that, the models created by the economic and engineering communities that do not employ yet the machine learning methods or other artificial intelligence methods provide us already with a great thoughts on what else we could do, or what is the gap between having great capabilities and yet the other set of questions not addressed. So now let's talk about the power sector and decarbonization. So what are the questions that we've heard earlier that the government, industries, and others really would like to learn more about, and that we may provide them help with, and yet still doing very little job about that? So those include what are true costs of deploying the clean energy, whether those renewables, hydrogen, other things. How the tightening of the carbon allowances and retiring of coal will affect the prices. And so this is something that the structural economists and engineers have been trying to understand, and yet their models have too much rigidity and do not allow the complexity that the artificial intelligence models allow. Yet artificial intelligence models quite often used for businesses for the purposes other than those named earlier. The other question is, through which channels do we see it will be most efficient to navigate the transition to the lower CO2 footprint? And so with that, turning back to the variables that we discussed earlier, look, for instance, into the price of carbon and looking into its historical development, the question, for instance, we may ask would be, what would be further the economic impact of increasing carbon prices? So let us just kind of look into that last piece of data and see what we can project from that. Or looking into the renewable capacity and the renewable generation. So how that increasing trend been affecting the prices? Can we project and simulate the risk, not from the engineering standpoint, but also from the economic and price perspective? Or looking into the increasing natural gas prices, which currently become extremely acute question from around the world, both for Asian Pacific region, as well as for Europe and the Americas. And so looking again into those high prices. And so what we did, we turned to our powerful models developed for the predicting power prices and tried to ask ourselves, what would happen if we indeed increase generation by 30%? And so the insight that we get is that, first of all, we did check that due to the fact that, for instance, speaking about Germany has as much renewable capacity as France nuclear capacity. We do have times when we have the renewable generation 100% time. So we have the range we don't need to be caring about extrapolation so much. And so there we'll look into how our scenario versus actual data will affect the distribution of power prices throughout the year. And then looking into how that average price would change, what is the standard deviation, provide potentially the hint to the policymakers that the increase in renewable generation is not necessarily may lead to the decrease in prices, because it may increase the hours when we use natural gas peakers, and with that make in sometimes the generation more expensive. And so further, we can also look into the distribution of the power prices over time to see how the differences in price burden may be distributed over time and how it may fall into different industries when the interaction between the heating season for the is interacting with the electricity used for the production. Along with that process of looking into the prices, we can also see how it may actually affect the emissions generated. Turning to the next question, so we can also perform similar analysis now looking into the tightening carbon allowances and looking into things such as increase in the carbon prices. There, once again, we can look into the distribution of the power prices that would be realized, would the carbon price be higher, and then compare it with the change in the renewable generation to see which tool with regard to the policymaker could be more efficient and how the distribution of the burden would be happening. Looking into the difference, we can also notice and calculate what will be the change in the public welfare and what would be the costs associated with the changes that fall into industry. We can also study the interaction effects and see whether putting the two together would lead to the additive costs or super additive, meaning that have even a higher increase in cost than the two scenarios separately. And so supporting the energy transition and sustainability, what we do have, we have the great modeling capability. We also have increasing amount of data to support our analysis on how the systems work. But with that, we have to focus more on the key drivers, how the list of those drivers changes over time, how those drivers change and affect economic and environmental outcome. With that, we are equipped to do this cost and benefit analysis to look about super and sub-additivity of costs as well as benefits with their necessity and ability to suggest the economic, public, and environmental perspective. And so with that, we have to keep developing not just predictions for some economic use, but also projections that would help inform on where we might be heading the stakeholders who have to either make decision on change the supply chain, change the production, switch to new energy carriers, whether it's hydrogen, ammonia, others. Also reveal some risk and uncertainty with regard to those prices and costs, and help to find the most efficient and effective instruments as we talk about particular sector, particular economy, or around the world. And with that, thank you very much, and I would welcome the questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Svetlana, for a really fascinating introduction to machine learning and its application to power systems and markets. So again, feel free to ask questions using the Q&A function, or if you are a panelist, you can raise your hand. So I'd like to start off with one question. So you showed us, you focused on how you can use these methods to forecast, to predict prices, and you also showed like a historical graph of prices, I think in Germany, up until now, basically, which shows this huge spike or increase in prices in the last year. So I was curious if you or others have attempted to apply these methods to what's the ability to forecast that kind of drastic change in prices?
Yeah, that's a great question. So our original research was done with the data through mid-2021, and we just recently updated with the last piece of data. So that's why I would like to emphasize the limited ability of most of the machine learning techniques to extrapolate, with a few exceptions that have some functional form in that. And so we did test the data when we had the data only through the mid-2021, where we haven't seen such a big natural gas prices, where we haven't seen some spikes in the carbon prices. Can we predict the high power prices? And so the short answer is no, we cannot do a good job. And yes, if you do day-to-day update on databases, this is what some of the traders do, you're getting better, versus if you just try to predict 2 months ahead or kind of 3 months ahead. So the further into the future you're trying to predict, the higher error. But with that being said, I also would like to mark that now we saw pretty much record prices, with that, we now equipped, and I believe by we, I'm saying, talking not just about Germany, but for many countries around the world, given what has been the geopolitical and economic development in the natural gas and other energy sectors, to actually try and go do the projections with really high energy prices. Okay, so now, so without those shocks, our predictions were not that good. We were not prepared to that. That's why many of us, and kind of myself as well, were skeptical about how high the price may go. So kind of I personally underestimated by over 30% where the peak will be. But now we've seen it, and I believe now we revealed something that economists usually have hard time to identify, the maximum willingness to pay. So when you really kind of shut down your heater, or when you stop your, almost stop your steel manufacturing, and now we have to take advantage of this data.
Hey, great. We are getting the data we need to train the models, I suppose. So we have a question here from Professor Ganesh Thakur. Do you want to ask yourself?
Oh, you muted, yes?
Yes,
okay.
Yes. First, thank you, Svetlana, for a very good talk. And my name is Ganesh Thakur. I'm a professor at the University of Houston in Texas. And my question is on the robustness of your model. Can you describe a challenging situation that you faced, and how did you deal with it?
Okay, that's an excellent question. So first of all, from my perspective, there is no consensus on what robustness means. So that's why I will describe a series of tests that we were running, which, by the way, I should say that we find the works that in some cases may do a better job. So what we do, we run we perform the runs where we change the length of the history of our sample, and then we're trying to predict next months, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, up to a year. And so with that, we and by changing the length of history, the way we do it is we not just change, I look just into the last year, I look in the last 2 years before the year I'm trying to predict, but also we do that kind of moving the window along the data. And so our idea is to see whether we can reveal any patterns with regard to the uncertainty or error of our predictions. So can we say that if we move the window, if we change the size of the window every time trying to predict the next year with all the variables, assuming that the variables for the predictions are perfectly known, yeah, and kind of looking only into the prices. So one thing that we were able to reveal that for most, we can have fairly good predictions. So I will kind of not provide you one measure because we'll look into both mean square error, but we'll also look into the distribution of those errors. So in some cases, we were focusing on how well we can predict the high values, or what's the difference in P50. Okay, so we're not doing it for traders. So with that, back to your question. So how did we test robustness? So we didn't test robustness, but we did test, and we provided actually as a matrix result on how high your errors could be, providing multiple descriptors for these errors. So again, MSC, but also the standard deviation, the high values, and so on. And we believe that in our research, we focus and refer to that matrix as the remember, be careful matrix. So we're not saying that our predictions are robust. And one of the things, as I said earlier, was the fact that when we tried to predict the period with a high prices, where we would give that the prices are known, but our model haven't seen it, we were not doing good job. So our error was really high. So so again, we're not saying that we're robust. We're saying that we can provide the matrix that shows you how high your error could be. The other part of the analysis that we do, however, besides providing that matrix, is we're trying to see whether that may be linked to how high was the variance in some data, or how many unseen earlier data we have in particular variables. So if you see, for instance, in the natural gas prices, 30% of the values from the unseen range, then here's kind of how high your error, and kind of that's what we link it to. And so with that, our conclusion is that we believe that the models are not necessarily robust. However, we should say that if the variables stay within a range, here is what you may expect as a distribution of error. However, if your values go beyond the range of the observed, you should expect higher error. And here's another example. So we're quite careful. That's why we're more into projections than predictions. But excellent question. Thanks a lot. I know you guys are experts in your age on those things. So try to.
I like your quotation. All models are wrong. Some are useful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. So we need to switch to the next talk very soon here. Maybe one final question from my end. So you talked primarily about machine learning models, but you also mentioned these other types of traditional models used for similar purposes, fundamental models or engineering economics models. Could you just say a little bit more about, when do you use what type of models, or should you use like a combination of models? Could machine learning models feed into existing fundamental models? Can you kind of lay out the landscape there for us?
Yes, so traditionally we use the structure models when we want to have again, some functional forms. So kind of back to the question of regressions, we want to identify what are the key drivers, how I go next, or if I would like to understand the strategic behavior of players. So due to the auction behavior, other things. So that's where AI models cannot provide us understanding of the strategies. So when we talk about the strategies and the reaction functions, so how one player, how the market may react to the certain change in behavior. So this is where AI models have not been used, but we believe that they have a capability, but with certain simulations. Back to engineering is, once again, it's hard to train your model on something that your model never seen. Like, for instance, if you go to some country where renewable generation have not been built at all, that's where engineering and economic models may help you. As a structural models, they can add certain things. They can functionally provide you technical and economic description of what may happen. And that's what the AI methods cannot do. They need the data for that. And so that's once again where we believe that if one on one hand may use the sets of models where you can have the testable hypothesis with AI, in other case where you can also be driven by the logic provided by the economic and engineering models to structure the projections of the AI models, that's where we see the further development. So this is our big conclusion for the future research agenda.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Svetlana. Very interesting presentation and great discussion.